I'm Kirsten Traynor. I'm currently based at the Institute of Bee Research in Celle, Germany, but I used to run my own apiary in Maryland, where I had about 30 mother colonies. I would produce about 100 and 150 nukes every spring, and I would raise about 300 queens. What you're seeing there on my thumb is one of the queens that I reared. I typically selected for carniolan stock. We have New World carniolans in the United States. And then they were open mated. And so the daughters were often a motley mix of bees. So you'll see a lot of stripy bees, you'll see some black bees and some yellows, but I preferentially always selected for black queens. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'm gonna go through the different reasons of why queens matter, different methods of queen rearing, a detailed look at setups for backyard beekeepers, and then lastly, how you can, as a backyard beekeeper, evaluate queen quality. Next slide, please. So why do queens matter? Of course, the queen is the mother of the hive. And so whatever her genetics are, those are the genetics she passes to the characteristics of the colony. And so depending on what you want in your own hive, then you are looking for characteristics in gentleness, lack of swarming, ability to produce a lot of honey, pollen hoarding, and things like that. So when you select for a queen, you're selecting for the properties that you want your entire colony to have. Next slide, please. So why breed bees? That's an excellent question. You're looking to breed bees for different characteristics that are important to you within your own colony. So what are the characteristics that you want within your own population? Are you looking for colonies that just survive well in your given locale? So there's a lot of emphasis now on local breeding populations. Are you looking for bees that are super gentle, that you can keep easily in a city or in a backyard? Are you looking for bees that have a tendency not to swarm? Are you looking for colonies that replace their own queen, and so you don't need to always be checking on the status of the hive? Next slide, please. So one option, of course, is to breed for more honey. Next. More resilience. Next. And resilience against pests and parasites. Next. And diseases. I apologize. I thought I had taken all these animations out. Next, please. I tend to typically select against less aggressiveness. So in my apiaries, if I ever have a colony that gets very hot, because I like to work without a veil in the spring and summer and always without gloves, any colony that's very aggressive, unless there's a situation of robbing going on, that queen will get the hive tool treatment and I will replace her. Next, please. And another reason that a lot of people are now looking to breed their own queens is for genetic preservation. They're looking to make sure that the populations that they have are able to survive and adapt. So there's increased interest in breeding, for example, Apis mellifera, the traditional black bee of Europe. Next, please. So when you are breeding in queens for your own needs, you need to prioritize your needs. You can't have everything at once. We all, have our centerfold idea of the perfect queen colony that doesn't need to be treated, that's highly productive for honey, that never needs to be managed for swarm management because they always want to stay in the box and produce a lot of honey. But unfortunately, you can't select for everything at once. So you really need to decide for yourself what's important to you. Next, please. Locally adopted stock is very important so that you have an opportunity to make sure that it will survive in your area. For example, in the United States, a lot of people order in package bees. Those packages come from the South with southern queens that are bred in Florida and Texas and Louisiana. They often don't do very well in our northern climates. Italian stock in general tends to keep brooding up all summer long and require a lot of honey stores, and they don't shut down brood rearing when the nectar dearth appears in mid-June. Whereas other stocks are more adapted to adjust their brood rearing to the nectar availability. Next, please. So high pollen hoarding, some beekeepers know that pollen is very important. It's the lipid profile, and the more diverse pollens that bees are collecting, the more diverse nutritional availability they have. And so there's also been a large selection program by Rob Page, predominantly to look at the genetic underpinnings of a lot of these behavioral traits for high pollen hoarding. Next, please. Some people want, if they're doing a lot of nuke production and their main business is selling bees, then they need colonies that build up really strong in the spring. So if you're looking to have lots of bee availability in early spring to make lots of nukes, then you're better off with a stock that is used to building up a more Mediterranean style climate. So the Italian bees tend to build up really strong very early if you give them enough stimulus with nectar and pollen patties. And so it really depends what you need for your own purposes when you make your choices as to what you're breeding for. Next, please. And then, of course, if you live in more northern climates or cool climates, you may want to be selecting for good overwintering. So one characteristic you can look for is colony size going into winter and colony size coming out of winter. And if that stays pretty constant, you would want to select from those colonies that come through the winter well and drop out any colonies that really lose a lot of mass over winter. Next, please. As I said, you can't have every trait, so you have to make some decisions as to what's important for you. Next, please. So don't believe everything you hear. When I first started out in beekeeping, I was told, queens, you can't rear them, you buy them, but it's really not that difficult to make your own queens. Next, please. As I said, leave the queen rearing to the experts. Next, please. But you can breed your own queens. We tend to make this sound much more difficult than it is, but the main requirements for breeding your own queens is to have really, really strong colonies in which to rear your cells. And then you need to take those cells and put them into new colonies before those queens emerge, or you need to cage those queens prior to emergence. Those are the two main things. So long as you have good genetics that you want to propagate, those are the ones you want to breed from. And then you need a really strong colony to produce queens. Next, please. So good genetics. Many traits are heritable, for example, pollen hoarding. The tendency to swarm is also heritable. So if you're always selecting swarm cells to make your splits, one thing you are definitely selecting for is colonies that like to leave your hive and hang out in trees. You can select for honey production, and over time you can significantly increase honey production, and you can increase the heritability of honey production. But if an area doesn't have enough nectar sources available, then you won't actually see a difference in an increase in honey just because there isn't enough for that colony to exploit. You can select for hygienic behavior. That's become quite popular. Those are bees that have a tendency to clean out any diseased cells. Hygienic behavior was originally selected for to provide resistance against American foul brood, and now it's being used as a Varroa tolerance trait. And then some people, especially in Eastern Europe, will also select for propolis collection or royal jelly production in Asia, because those are the products they're wanting to harvest. So you have to decide what is important to you. And because most people are backyard beekeepers with only 5 to 10 hives, you need to cooperate with like-minded beekeepers. You by yourself usually do not have a large enough population. So of course you can select your best colonies, but unless you have access to an isolated mating station or are doing artificial insemination, your queens will be open mated. So it helps if you have a like-minded group and you can develop an area or a region where you guys are all selecting for similar traits. Next, please. So what are your goals? When I was breeding on a small scale in my apiary in Maryland, my goals were gentleness, no swarming, and longevity. And the reason I chose this picture is you can see the prominent hive tool there as well. Any colony that is excessively aggressive, I would find that queen and I would eliminate her, because I predominantly was producing nukes for new beekeepers. And so gentleness was extremely important for me. No swarming was also very important because often I ran my bee business as a side income. And so I didn't always have time to get after my hives as often as I should. So colonies that had a tendency to swarm, I would often show up in my outyards because they had a slightly different temperature range, even though they were only 15 minutes away. And so I would always judge them based on my home yard. My home yard tended to be a lot cooler. And so by the time I was aware that I needed to do swarm management, some of my other apiaries were already getting ready to swarm. So it was always good to be selecting against swarming activity. So colonies that built up well, came through the winter well, and didn't swarm were the ones I prioritized in my selection process. And in doing that, because I always bred off colonies that had made it through at least one winter preferably 2. I was also selecting for longevity. So it was not unusual for the queens that I bred off my colonies to last 2, 3, or even 4 years. And what was really nice is that they would then often rear a daughter, and the mother and daughter would both be laying in a colony at the same time. And once they had accepted the new daughter, they would then replace the older mother. And that would usually happen in year 2, 3, or 4. Next, please. So what are you needing to do? You need, as I said, breeding is cooperative, your selection, and you need to share your queens with other people interested in breeding as well. You need a large population. Without mating stations or insemination, it's impossible to control your cross. And so here you see a photo from one of the mating stations that our institute runs here in Germany. This is an older photo from 2007. And this is a private mating station, but we also have open mating stations where beekeepers can drop off their queens and then pick them up 2 weeks later, and they've been then mated by the drones that we provide at that station. Next, please. So this is a video, and if you're watching the video, is there anything that you notice? And if you look on the top right there, there's actually a marked queen. She's got a white dot on her thorax. And as you notice, the bees are kind of ignoring her. This is actually a queen that I had ordered in. She'd been shipped. And so she'd been out of a colony for about a week before she was introduced. And so she loses her queenliness when she is not allowed to lay eggs during that shipping process. And so don't judge a queen if you're ordering queens in that first week. You want to see what they're like after about 2 to 3 weeks, and especially the characteristics of a colony 3 weeks later when her own brood starts to emerge. So about 6 weeks post installation of a mated queen, the colony has pretty much turned over to her genetics, and that's when you can start evaluating the quality of that queen. Next, please. So there are different methods of queen rearing. They can be very high tech, they can be very low tech. A lot of beekeepers just make splits and then hope for the best. These are called walkaway splits. Next, please. And so with a walkaway, you typically find a colony that's very strong. You're trying to stop that colony from swarming, and so you make a split. So you take fruit frames with open brood, preferably with eggs and young larvae. There's some young larvae and older larvae in that top left image. You need to do this with a really strong colony, and then you put them in a separate split. The forager bees, if you only have one apiary, will return home. So you want to try and select frames with some emerging brood as well, so that those bees, because they're young nurse bees, will stay with that colony. You always, when you're making a split within the same apiary, you want to make it a little stronger in its foraging force than usual, because all the old bees that are already out foraging will return home to the original location. And then the bees will start selecting larvae, and they will rear an emergency queen. Next slide, please. And this is typically what emergency queens look like. So they are rerouted worker brood. The bees do a sort of gold Ruberg, and they float that larva out, and then they draw a queen cell around it. Walkaways, though, are emergency queens. The colony is going into emergency mode, and because queen development is very, very short, it's 16 days compared to the 21 days of worker brood, they will often select slightly larger and older larvae to draw into emergency queens. And so sometimes your emergency queens will be a little smaller, they'll have less ovarials. For a home backyard beekeeper, this doesn't usually make a huge difference, but if you're using it as your only method for selection, over time you can end up with smaller queens that are slightly less reproductive, because you're not taking a queen that has been reared as a queen from the very beginning. Rather, she had already started down the pathway of worker development. Remember that eggs for workers and queens are identical, and it's only once they hatch that they are fed different diets. And it's this constant food of royal jelly that turns a queen into a queen, whereas a worker is basically a starved queen. Workers have a controlled diet where in the first 3 days of larval development, they get a very protein-rich food, but it's fed incrementally. And then the bees start adding a more sugar content in it, which causes the final development and differentiation. And it also causes ovarial apoptosis, so that workers end up being born with very, very few ovarials. Those are the threads that make up the ovaries that allow them to lay eggs. Next, please. Another way of making your own queens is, of course, with swarm cells. So one great way to always look for swarm cells when you're doing your regular swarm management is if you have a hive in a 2-story box, you can tilt it backwards and then look upwards to see if you have swarm cells. As soon as you see eggs within a swarm cell, if you don't want your colony to swarm, you have to intervene. Remember, it's an egg for 3 days, and a queen cell is capped about 5 days after that egg hatches. So within a week of you seeing eggs in swarm cells, your colony may already be up in a tree, because as soon as a swarm cell is capped, that colony will swarm on a warm day. They don't wait for that new queen to emerge. And so here on the far right, you see a typical swarm cell. They're typically on the bottom of brood frames. Usually when a colony is getting ready to swarm, they don't just rear one, but rather they rear anywhere from 12 to 23 or more. And in a really strong colony, you can get a lot of swarm cells. So you can make a lot of splits with swarm cells. You want to only leave 1 or 2 swarm cells per split that you make, so that your split doesn't end up throwing an after swarm as well. Next slide, please. The one thing you do have to realize that if you do all of your queen rearing from swarm cells, so your queen selection process is basically you just putting frames of brood with swarm cells into hives and allowing the natural process to occur. One thing you are definitely selecting for is the tendency to swarm. And so just be aware of that. You over time will have more and more colonies that will always be wanting to swarm. Next, please. Another option is cutting out or punching out eggs. There's lots of different ways to avoid grafting. For example, there's the French Nico system. You can cut comb on a sharp angle, triangular, so that you have tongues, and that'll give the bees a place to also draw queen cells. You can punch out eggs with bullet casings. If you do searches online, there's all sorts of options if you don't want to graft. I, however, highly recommend that you learn how to graft. Remember, as a backyard beekeeper trying to rear only a few queens, you can graft 20 to 40 larvae, and if only 2 or 3 are accepted the first time, you still have 2 or 3 new queens that are being reared. If you have trouble seeing the young larva, I highly recommend you engage a younger individual with good eyesight. They don't have to be involved with the bees. You need to basically put an empty frame that's fully drawn, preferably a dark brood frame, into the middle of the brood nest where your queen is, and then come back 4 days later. She will have laid eggs immediately on that frame in the spring in a nice strong colony. 4 days later, those eggs will be newly hatched, and you will have the appropriately aged larva. You can take that frame off, brush out all the bees, wrap it in a towel, and then bring it inside and allow somebody with good eyesight to try grafting for you. So it's an excellent way to interest your children or your grandchildren in helping you with your bee business, even if they are not interested in bees at all. And once you get good at grafting, it really only takes about 10 minutes to graft 3 frames of larvae that you can then put in your colony and rear 30 queens. Next, please. Oops, one of the images seems, if you hit next, does that image on the, there we go. Thank you. So grafting allows you to use perfectly aged larvae. You can see them here in the top left. Those are young larvae. They're about 12 hours old. They've just recently hatched, and that's what you're then grafting into your queen cups. You can see 2 grafted larvae on the far top right. The one in the top is appropriately aged. The one below that is actually a little older. You can still rear a perfectly good queen out of that, but that's really the maximum size larva you want to rear. You don't want it any bigger than that. Next, please. And so one way that you can then, what do you do with those grafted larvae? The best way to rear them is in a queenless colony that is brushed into a swarm box. So you basically end up with a box onto which you can attach this funnel thing. If you don't have a funnel, you can actually just brush bees straight into a nuke box and then add frames on top. What you want to do is go through a few of your colonies, find frames of young nurse bees, so frames where new bees are emerging. Your brood frames with young larvae on it are also excellent because there'll be a lot of nurse bees on those frames. Make sure your queen is not on the frame, and then you brush those frames into a nuke box until you have about 3 pounds of bees. You can guesstimate this. You can use a scale or you can guesstimate it. So you want 3 pounds of young bees. You want on the bottom of this swarm box a sponge with water, or you can take a comb that's empty and run it underneath a faucet, and then it will have water that way. And you want a frame of nectar and you want a frame of pollen. So you're basically creating a swarm in a box in which you've put resources. And then you want to put that box in your garage for a minimum of 12 hours. I usually make it the day before, and then I graft on the next day. And then I take my swarm box. Those bees have now clustered. They know they're queenless. They're eager to rear queens, and they have not a single larva. So this swarm box is really only made with pollen and nectar and no brood at all. Then you go ahead and you graft your frame of larvae, and then you hang it into this swarm box when they've been sitting queenless. Sometimes if I'm rushing, I'll make my swarm box and then I'll graft into it an hour later because I didn't get a chance to make it the day before. That'll be fine too. You put in your frame of grafted larvae and you leave them at least 24 to 48 hours. You can leave them up to 72 hours, but then you'll start having some bee death within that box. So I usually leave them 24 to 48 hours. And because you have lots and lots of young nurse bees in that swarm box, they will draw out all of those cells. Anyone that you grafted appropriately, you'll see within 24 hours, they've already started drawing out a cell around it. And then you can put that in a finisher. Next, please. So here is a queen right system. So if there's multiple ways of rearing queens. So if you do that swarm box, you can then finish them out in this queen right system, ideally. In a queen right system, in your lower brood box, you have your queen represented here by the crown in the purple circle. You have lots of open brood. You give that queen open drawn comb in which she can keep laying so she doesn't feel a swarm drive. And then you have a queen excluder. Above that queen excluder, you have cap brood that's about ready to emerge. This is cap brood still needs to be kept warm, so it will draw a lot of nurse bees up through that queen excluder. You want nectar available in that queen right system, or you can feed. You need to mimic a nectar flow because they rear queens in the spring when they're trying to swarm. Remember, that's their tendency to reproduce. And so you need to mimic those conditions. And then those cells that you started in your swarm box, you then can hang up to 2 frames into this top queen right system, and they will finish drawing them out and capping them. And so it's, remember, 3 eggs is the egg stage, then the larva hatches and queens are capped 5 days later. So when those cells are capped 5 days later, you can either take them out and put them into nukes and allow them, those queen cells, to emerge and go on a mating flight. Sometimes they won't emerge, and then you have to check that nuke and see that it's queenless and recombine it with something. Or you can wait until day 12 and then put cages on day 10 post-grafting is day 14. Your queen will emerge on day 16. So you can also get a cage system, those hair curler systems, and cage each one of these queen cells. And then the queens will emerge in that cage within your colony. And then you can take those virgin queens and install them into your nukes where you want a new queen, and they can go on mating flights. Next slide, please. The other thing you can do if you don't want to do the swarm box, if that's time consuming or you want another method, is you can make a queenless system 1 week prior to grafting. So this is great if you want to be on a weekly basis. So let's say you always want to do your queen work on a Saturday. So 1 week before you want to graft, you go through 3 or 4 colonies and you pull out all frames of emerging brood that you can find there. You want to make sure there are no young larvae or eggs if possible. And you collect all of those frames of emerging brood into 1 colony. So you want to end up with about 6 to 8 frames of emerging brood in this really, really strong hive. So you are creating, in effect, a nurse bee incubator. You want to make sure they have food resources. So you want to give them honey and you want to give them pollen. And then you also want to, if there's no nectar flow on, stimulate them with some feed. Next, please. And then you can remove those frames of brood will have emerged. You have no queen in there. So a week later, you want to go through that hive, make sure There are no emergency queens, just in case you missed a young egg or a young larva. By then, they will have drawn that into an emergency cell. So you want to take each frame, knock the bees off, brush the bees off so you can get a really good glance at both sides of the frame, destroy any emergency cells, and then you can hang your frame of grafted larvae into that colony. Remember, you made it a week before with lots of young bees that are emerging. Bees start nursing between about 3 to 7 days of age. So now you have lots and lots of young nurses. They know they're queenless. And now you can hang in 1 or 2 frames of grafted larvae, and they will rear you really beautiful queen cells. So you have lots of young bees, you have plenty of food stores, and then you want to give them a feeder bucket or an in-hive feeders so that they have lots of nectar coming in as well, which will cause them to draw really healthy queen cells for you. Next, please. This is a video just to show the hair curler system. Can you play that video? There we go. And you can see that my queens are actually have emerged in that second one from the right. There's a queen running around in that cage. And so this is just, if you want to finish rearing out your queens in a hive on day 10 post-grafting, you can put these hair curlers on those Nico cells. And then they're a fixed system. The queens emerge in there. Often you will put a little bit of honey on the bottom of those cages because queens can be kind of dumb and they'll crawl right back up into their cell and won't allow themselves to be fed. But if you put a little bit of honey at the bottom of that roller cage, then they have a food source right away. And then on day 16, you can come back, you see 16 post egg laying, so 12 days post grafting. And your queens will be emerged, and then you can pop each one off and install them into a queenless hive that you've made. Next, please. Yeah. So here you just see I've made a split. It's been queenless for 24 hours, and then I put one of these hair curler cages on top, and I just allow that virgin queen in her own time. Sometimes they run the wrong way. You'll see it takes a little bit, but eventually she does end up walking out of this roller cage, walking down into the hive, and then you come back about 10 days later to make sure she's gone on her mating flight and has started to lay eggs. Whenever you're working with virgin queens, you want to give them 2 weeks is usually about the time that you want to come back and control, because about 20% of your queens don't make it back from their mating flight. That's quite normal. They're large insects, especially on a cool spring. They're perfect bird food, and some of them just don't make it back. So you want to make sure that you check that colony. There she comes. And so you can see she kind of comes cautiously out into the hive. Worker bees chase her back in because they're excited to have a queen. And this time she really does come out. And you'll notice she almost immediately goes right down into the dark. Queens like to hang out in the dark for their first few days. They're activating their body and being fed. And then they go on that mating flight. And so you can find eggs within 10 days of your virgin queen release, but it's best to leave it about 2 weeks and then come back and check. And then any colony that's queenless, you can install a nuke on top, or you can try with a second queen, but I usually find that once a queen has failed, it's better to combine that with another one. You can put your queens into larger colonies or smaller, depending on what you want. You want at least 3 frames of bees, I find, if you're working with full-size equipment for your mating nukes. You can use small mating boxes, but those require more management, and you have to turn those queens over very quickly because once they're mated, they'll fill that up in about a week, and then those little tiny mating boxes can swarm. So I've always used full-size nuke boxes, and instead of using 5 frames, I usually put 3 frames of bees in there, introduce a queen, give them 1 frame of foundation to keep them occupied, and 1 empty comb so the queen has a place to lay eggs. Next, please. And here you can just see one of my queens. These are what I call tiger stripes. So I selected from carniolan stock, but it was open mated. You can actually see an egg hanging out the tip of her abdomen. She's checking each cell. She measures it with her forelegs. If it looks appropriate and she likes it, she'll stick her abdomen in. She'll lay an egg. And this is an excellent way of judging queen quality. See how many bees are in her retinue? They're constantly antenating her and touching her and picking up her pheromone and spreading it throughout the whole hive. Next, please. And so what kinds of setups are good for backyard beekeepers? As I said, all you really need is a really strong colony of bees, and you can rear queens. Next. You want lots and lots of bees in the box, and you can use just a nuke box. If you load a nuke box up with 5 frames of emerging brood from other colonies a week before you want to graft, it will be perfect for rearing queen cells for you. And you can let them finish rearing out those queen cells. You don't have to have a starter and finisher. It really depends on how many queens you're trying to rear. I tend to do the swarm box starter and then a finisher because I'm trying to rear a lot of queens at once. And I found that has a really high success rate. But if you're only looking to rear 5 to 10 queens, you can do everything you want in a single nuke box, graft right into that nuke box, allow them to draw those cells out, and then on day 10, take those cells and introduce them into queenless nukes so they can go on mating flights. Next, please. So you can graft 3 bars, and if only 3 to 5 take, you still have queens. You can see that there was a really good nectar flow on because those queen cells are really light yellow mottled. The more mottling a cell has, the better fed and better cared for that queen is. If you end up seeing that your cells are quite small or very, very dark wax, then you know the bees are reusing wax in the colony and they're lacking enough nectar coming in. You really want to mimic the spring conditions. So if you think about what's going on when your colonies want to swarm, you want to create similar conditions, a crowded brood nest, lots of food coming in, and then they will rear really healthy queens for you. Next, please. As I said, a nuke box can work. Here you see me going through colonies where I'm looking for brood that's emerging. I create this really strong nuke box overflowing with bees, 5 frames of brood that's emerging. I let it sit for a week, and then I can graft right into that nuke box. I used all medium depth frames, so there's actually a space on the bottom, so I could put a sponge and a feeder dish with straw in the bottom as well that created a food source. I graft into them, and if I leave them open in a yard, I can graft into them and let that nuke finish out those queens. I wouldn't do more than about 15, 20 queens in a nuke box like this and not a full-size colony. But if you're a backyard beekeeper and you're really only trying to rear 5 or 10 queens, just a nuke box is the perfect setup for you. Next, please. And then how do you evaluate queen quality? Here you can see me on the left. I have a handful of mated queens in my hand, and the bees love them and are desperately trying to hang on to my hand because of that amazing queen pheromone. Next, please. So one thing you can judge the colony by is, as I said, the queen retinue size. This is what I mean by a queen retinue. You can see all those bees forming a perfect circle around that queen. They're touching her, they're antenating her, they're picking up her queen pheromone, and they're spreading it throughout a hive. When you order in mated queens and they come via the mail, those queens have usually been taken out of their hive and have not been laying for about a week before you receive them. And so they don't smell as queen-like. And so when you introduce those queens, sometimes if it's a valuable queen, and if you paid a lot of money for it, it's better to introduce her under a push-in cage on a frame of bees that are emerging. Those newly emerged bees don't know any other queen. They'll readily accept her, and then those cells that they have emerged out of, she can start laying eggs into. And then her full queen pheromone bouquet will come back. They'll be much more readily to accept her. And so you want to introduce her underneath the cage if it's a really valuable queen, come back 3 to 4 days later, make sure she's laying, and then you can remove that cage and observe how the bees are interacting with her. And if they're not attacking her or anything, then you know she's been accepted. Next, please. You also want to evaluate your queens by their brood pattern. So you should learn what looks like a good brood pattern. And if there are gaps in your brood pattern, look into those cells and try to understand why there's a gap. Sometimes it's just a cell packed with pollen. Sometimes you have so much nectar coming in that they've backfilled the brood nest a little bit. You want to make sure that when that queen is laying, she's laying in arches. So she'll usually lay a patch in the center of eggs, and then she'll expand that and expand that. And so when you look at your brood nest pattern, you want to see older larvae in the center surrounded by younger larvae. and you want to evaluate your queen by her egg laying pattern. This will also give you an insight into when your queen is starting to fail. If she used to lay corner to corner and now she's having smaller patches of brood, she may just be aging out on you, and you may want to replace her with a new queen. Next, please. And then I tend to select for longevity. So this queen that you're seeing here on the top of my frames, on the top bar, totally surrounded by bees that are still antenating her. She was still going strong in her 3rd year. So there's a lot of advice that you should replace your queens every year because young queens have less of a tendency to swarm. But I always say you don't want to kill the golden goose. So if you have a queen who's made it through the winter, the colony is doing really, really well, and you can manage their swarm drive so they're not trying to take off on you, why would you want to get rid of her? Those are the Goldilocks bees, the ones that are absolutely perfect for backyard beekeeping because they don't require a huge amount of management. And so those are the queens I preferentially want to keep. Next, please. And then you really want to evaluate the colony characteristics. As I said, after about 6 weeks that queen's been in there, there's been a turnover in population. Most of those bees are now her daughters. And that's when you want to start evaluating the quality of the colony to see, does it have the gentleness that they want? Are they runny on the frame? If they're super runny, it makes it much more difficult to evaluate colony characteristics. And that may not be something you want to select for. So you need to make decisions as to what you want, and those colonies that do really well for you in your own local conditions, those are the ones you want to preferentially select for in your breeding purposes. Next, please. And that was basically my whirlwind run through queen breeding. I hope it's given you some ideas of how to get active in your own backyard. You don't need a huge setup. Go ahead and practice grafting. You can take as I said, if you take a drawn frame, an old brood comb, these are when you go in for your early spring management and your bees are up in your second box and that bottom box is empty. Those old dark combs that you would normally take out and use and melt down because you want to get rid of the residues in your colony, keep 1 or 2 of those back because dark brood comb is perfect for the queen. She really enjoys laying in it. And then if you want to learn how to graft, put that in a strong colony in the middle of the brood nest. So not smack in the middle, but about 1 or 2 frames out from the center of the brood nest. Put that empty frame between 2 frames of young open larvae, and your queen will automatically find that frame and lay in it. If you come back 4 days later, those eggs that she laid almost immediately in there will have hatched. They'll be the perfect aged larvae for you to try grafting. Brush all those bees off, take it inside, lay down some newspaper, and just try grafting. See what, you're not going to harm anything. The most you're doing is your colony, which is super strong anyway, is losing partial frame of brood. You can then always hang that frame back in, the queen will lay in it again, and you can come back and keep trying. It's really not that difficult to learn how to graft. You need a good light source. Often the light on our cell phones will be ideal for it if you don't have a fiber optic light. And just go ahead and try. It's a lot easier than a lot of people make it out to be. And I'm happy to take any questions.
In the presentation, you had frames marked as nectar. Can you give a little bit more detail on what you mean by that? So is that just uncapped stores, or would you suggest putting feeder frames in?
You can use feeder frames, which will work very well. But yes, you want uncapped honey, and preferably, you know, in the spring when you take a frame and you just hold it and you end up with droplets on your shoes, that's the type of frame you want. Bees preferentially consume nectar and not honey. Honey, they have to thin back down with water so that they can actually utilize it. And so when you're rearing queens, you want that nectar that's coming in straight during the nectar flow, or you can mimic that by feeding a 1-to-1 sugar solution.
Hi, I just wondered what sort of grafting tool you like to use, and how do you look after it? Do you clean it in boiling water or prep it with anything in particular?
Excellent question. I know a lot of people love the Chinese grafting tools. If you are using the Chinese grafting tools, it helps to soak them in a glass of warm water so that the horn that is used at the tip is a little softer. A lot of beekeepers will even take it in their mouth and suck on it a little bit to soften it up. I personally have never quite gotten used to the Chinese grafting tool. And so I use the stainless steel grafting tools out of Switzerland and Germany. I really like them. But you can also make your own grafting tool. We at Arizona State University had a very creative bee lab technician, and he would make them out of a pencil with a little metal nail that he had removed the lead from the pencil and put that in, and then flattened it on the edge. So you can make your own grafting tools if you want. Ideally, you want to wipe them down with alcohol, but even if you don't do that, just wiping them down with a cloth.
We often hear that we're using the word breeding. Well, surely selection is a better word, because as soon as you use the word breeding, it puts a lot of beekeepers off.
It's not true breeding unless you're controlling the drone population. And so this is really selecting for the best characteristics that are functioning in your hive and rearing offspring from things that are working well in your colony. So yes, selection is an excellent term for it. Breeding is usually what beekeepers tend to throw about. I just want to encourage people to make queens from colonies that are functioning really well in their own situation.
If you're open mating these queens, would the presence of drones on your own hives would be a good indicator that they would successfully mate?
So queens typically avoid mating with drones in their own area. Queens have a longer flight range. And so if you're finding drones in your own apiary, it's a good sign, if you're finding lots of drones, that it's the right appropriate time for rearing queens, because there's drones out and about in the area. But queens typically fly out quite a ways. They fly typically about 6 kilometers or more to be mated. We also tend to know that they go on one mating flight. Some queens will actually go on a second mating flight the next day. And they're typically mated by 10 to 30 drones. What's really nice is when you're just rearing a few queens in your own backyard, there isn't a whole lot of competition for those drones. And so those queens tend to be extremely well mated. Whereas when you talk about commercial queen rearing, at least in the United States, they're often producing 200,000 queens at a given time. And those are massive amounts of drones that you require. The more drones a queen mates with, the more resilience that colony typically has.
Regarding your grafting and the cell cups you're grafting into, have you found much difference between, letting the bees prime the cups or whether you've moistened the cups with water or queen royal jelly? Any hints there?
What I have done in the past is the grafting bars that I want to use, I put them into the colony the day before I want to graft into them and let the bees polish them out. That seems to work really well, but I found it's not really necessary. If I take the Jay-Z Beezy cups that are used in the US and you can pop them into any wood bottom bar, they fit right in there, or you can buy the plastic bars that fit them perfectly. I've just taken those straight out of the plastic bag, grafted into them, and had really good acceptance rates. So I think we need to worry less about it. What you want to do is you want to graft, and you want to get those grafts back into a colony as quickly as possible. And while you're grafting, if you're new and it's taking you more time, if you've done a single bar, what I do is I wrap them in a damp paper towel while I'm grafting the next bar. And so long as you don't have huge amounts of time and you get them into a strong colony, you usually have very good acceptance rates.
What about genetic diversity issue? If you tend to breed from just one, the best queen, and then her daughters and daughters, you may end up inbreeding eventually after a couple of years. Wouldn't it be better to select not just one, the best queen, but also mainly the best, but also some others to maintain genetic diversity still?
So your queen is going out and mating with all the drones in the area. You can't control who she's mating with unless you have an isolated mating station or in doing insemination. So if you're only rearing a few queens, you can go ahead and keep selecting from your best stock, because each time your crosses are going to be different. As I said, you want to collaborate with the people who live in your area because you all want to sort of work together. You as an individual, as a backyard beekeeper, don't really have enough colonies to do true breeding and selection. So just use what's good for you and don't be afraid to make queens off of it.
Some breeders advocate double grafting into a cell so that you're doubling on the royal jelly in there. But does one really need to worry about that with the... Thank you.
If you make a really, really strong swarm box, or you do that where lots and lots of, where you take the cap brood that's emerging and you just pack a hive full of cap brood that's ready to be emerging, and they've sat queenless for a week, they will stuff those cells with so much royal jelly, especially if you're only trying to rear 10 to 30 cells at a time. They will have all the food they need. You do not need to worry about double grafting. I found that with double grafting, I tend to drown more larvae because you have to be more careful in setting that larva down. As I said, if you graft and you get them back into a hive that's been sitting queenless for at least 24 hours, they will feed those larvae almost instantly. And so there's no real time that they're without food.
Probably a silly question, but if you've got more queens than you have nooks, is there anything you can do with the queens, or do you just have to let them die?
So if you have more queens than you have nukes, if you have those hair roller cages, you can keep queens for about 2 weeks as virgins on top of a queenless hive. In those cages, the bees will tend to them, and you will very quickly make friends with beekeepers in the area if you can supply extra queens.